Hi, all. I'm Savannah Spirit, the co-founding curator of Don't Delete Art, and I run the newsletter here with Emma Shapiro, and we're the editors of the newsletter, and we are doing things a little differently today. We are going to actually interview Annie Brown, and so I want to introduce Emma Shapiro, our editor-at-large. So take it away, Emma, and introduce.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emma Shapiro. I'm the editor-at-large of the Don't Delete Art campaign, and I'm very excited about this new multimedia facet to our newsletter and to introduce Annie Brown, who is the creator of Lips.Social media platform, which some of you may know about already, and she's the founder of Reliabl. She's also a visiting scholar at UC San Diego. So thank you so much for being here, Annie. We are huge fans of yours, and we love talking to you every time we get a chance to. We're very excited to introduce you to the Don't Delete Art community and to hear all about Reliabl and how you created Lips and what the future holds.
Yeah, well, just very happy to be here. I'm likewise a huge fan of your campaign and your writing, and just I think it's really important, the work that y'all are doing. So happy to support and happy to have a nice convo with you guys.
Fantastic. Well, I figure we start with just asking how Lips started and what the journey from creating what I understand was a paper zine up through a social media platform and now a moderating system. What has that journey been like?
Yeah, so it's been a almost lifelong journey, I guess. So basically, when I was growing up in high school, I was a big reader of Cosmopolitan magazine, 17 magazine. We didn't have Instagram, but we did have those magazines. And the problem with those magazines is that, as study after study showed, it really harmed my self-esteem. And I, late in high school, and it wasn't, and I always like to point out that it's not just like these magazines and these media forms don't necessarily cause things like eating disorders or, it's that they harm people who are already vulnerable to, to being in that place. And so, I was already vulnerable from family history, from, childhood trauma, things like that. And then, the magazine on top of it just kind of broke the camel's back. I developed an eating disorder when I was in high school and then went into college. But one of the luckiest things that happened to me is I was interested in history in general. That's what I went to school for. And like women's history class or women's studies sort of came up as one of those things. So I ended up taking an introduction to women's studies class, and as a project for that class, they asked us to create a solution to a problem they saw on campus. And so I had noticed that there were a lot of young women like myself that were struggling with, their sexuality, their body image. And, I wanted to create an alternative to 17 magazine, Cosmopolitan magazine, something that would be fun to read, but not as toxic or harmful. So I created Lips. It was sort of a little bit of a selfish project in that, I did a lot of self-healing through the zine. But what was really cool is that it took off. A lot of people really loved it. Through that first zine, I created art for it. I read other people's art for it. Basically, anybody could submit from campus anonymously. It doesn't matter your gender, your sexuality. You could submit anonymously, you could submit signed, but basically, if you had something to say about your sexuality, gender, sex in general, or just want to talk about your mental health, you could submit it. So I didn't see that as too revolutionary, but, the administration at the college did not like it one bit. And so that was my first taste of censorship, was essentially the zine, even though we were a campus publication, even though we were very popular with the student body, we could not get any funding from the college to be an official campus publication. And so it took a lot of fighting. It took a lot of campaigning. to finally get that status. And I was getting personal phone calls telling me, you know, that I was ruining the campus and that I was making young women on campus more promiscuous. So like, not a lot has changed, I guess you could say. And so, you know, I graduated, Lips took off on its own. It opened up into 5 different campuses throughout the Southeast United States. You know, there's still a chapter at William and Mary. And I always, you know, just kind of viewed it as a hobby. I created zines or chapters wherever I lived, but I myself got into marketing and got into the startup world in marketing. And, you know, while I was in the startup world, I really saw that I had kind of viewed creating a startup as something that was completely, you know, really hard to do, which it is, but, you know, something that's like basically impossible to do, right? Like something that would not be something accessible to someone like me. But then I was fortunate enough to be part of a startup that was in Y Combinator. So I got to kind of see the Y Combinator perspective. And to be honest, I saw a lot of startups that were not the best ideas, you know, getting a lot of funding, not run by people that had a lot of experience. And I thought, you know, I think I could do this. You know, I think Lips, the transition from magazine to social media feels right. And there's definitely a need for it. And, you know, the creating a paper chapter, you know, across the United States was just a little bit too analog, a little bit too expensive. So yeah, we built our MVP and we launched the MVP around the same time that the Tumblr porn ban happened. And what we saw was that, you know, we had grown a pretty big following on Instagram at that time. We had a lot of traffic to our MVP site, but with that Tumblr porn ban, we saw that our Instagram, we were shadow banned on Instagram pretty soon after that. You know, our Tumblr page got shut down. A lot of the artists that were on the Lips site were talking about how they were banned. So we saw this overlap of, you know, us being able to be leaders in this space against, you know, what we'll talk about later, this infrastructural deplatforming, essentially that marginalized communities are being pushed to the fringes of the internet. And so that's sort of how Reliabl came along, is that within Lips, we had to build a lot of our own infrastructure in order to exist. So like we had to build our own moderation system because we could have plugged into the algorithms that Instagram or Tumblr are using, but those would have, you know, erased half our content. And so we had to really like rethink how to exist on the internet without succumbing to these oppressive, a lot of times religious forces. And so, you know, we're not on the App Store. We're a progressive web app, which means you can download it from your own site. We have our own moderation system. And all of these things we found that other platforms, other communities need as well. And so that's where Reliabl came along, is essentially we're, you know, the technologies we're building for the Lips community, we're now being able to build those technologies and put them around the internet to make the internet a better place as a whole.
Can I ask you, can you talk about what is infrastructural deplatforming?
Yeah. So
I'm not familiar with that at all, and I'm sure others are not. So if you can talk a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, so it's an interesting term that, you know, myself, you know, as an independent researcher, as a researcher with UC San Diego, I'm digging in more myself too. But essentially, it's when we talk about deplatforming, you're often talking about one person. So like, you know, we talk about in the case of Don't Delete Art, an artist who uses nudity in their art, and they are then, you know, either shadow banned on a platform, or they're fully deplatformed. Their account is deleted. So that's deplatforming. Infrastructural deplatforming takes the next step, where it's the actual infrastructure that keeps those platforms up and running that's being pulled out. So an example of that would be FOSTA SESTA. I would consider an example of that because essentially the FOSTA SESTA law is an anti-trafficking law, but it's not actually functioning that way right now. It's functioning as a threat to these platforms, saying that if you don't, adhere to these certain guidelines, we will, push you out. And there's a complicated thing there with FOSTA SESTA because in some ways it's a threat, and in some ways platforms are choosing to just take the easy route and just push marginalized users. I'd say the app stores are another example of infrastructural deplatforming. So essentially, for the case of Lips would not have been approved to be in the Apple Store. And then a really common case of infrastructural deplatforming is payment processors. So, Visa, MasterCard saying we're not going to serve Pornhub anymore, or Visa, MasterCard saying we're not going to serve OnlyFans anymore. And essentially what that does, instead of impacting that one person like deplatforming does, infrastructural deplatforming affects an entire platform of people, an entire swath of people. So, it can occur. It's a trend that is now, I think payment processor is the most, in the media version of the trend, but it is becoming more and more common for people to be pushed off of MailChimp, for people to be, pushed off of Airbnb. There's all sorts of things where essentially, because the infrastructure is biased against these groups, then it forces the platforms to be biased against those groups as well.
Yeah, certainly. It's a major issue, and we at Don't Delete Art have been trying to educate our community on the deeper reasons why, say, your artwork is being taken down from Instagram. It isn't just a matter of them not understanding what you're doing. There are these other layers at play, and we get more and more artists reaching out to us who they're not even talking about social media platforms. They are unable to process payments through Stripe, and they're unable to show their work on other kinds of platforms that aren't social media. And it's a major issue, and artists, in my opinion, need to understand the structural problem at play here and what's at risk. And I think that Lips, at least on your social media presence through Instagram, you do a great job of educating people. You share a lot of articles, you do a lot of great infographics that really help educate about this and hopefully draw people to the Lips platform. So I just want to establish for our listeners here, viewers, who is Lips for? Like, how would you describe that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in my mind, Lips was created for women, LGBTQ, non-binary, and BIPOC creators. And essentially, those groups were groups that we saw were being unfairly pushed to the margins of the internet. So it really doesn't matter. And what's really interesting and I think sad too is that a lot of times it doesn't even matter what the content of the post or the creation was. A lot of times it came back to who the artist was or who the creator was. So, there was a survey that, Huffington Post did that essentially found that women business owners, because it used to be that, and maybe it still is, I haven't checked, but like your business would have a gender, right? And so you could, if you switched your business's gender from female to male, then your shadow ban would be lifted. You would automatically have, so many more followers. You would be less likely to have a post deleted. And so, that is the original intent of Lips, is essentially saying, hey, if you feel like you are being pushed to the margins of the internet unfairly, then this is a place for you. We have a little bit of a unique approach to free speech on Lips that we call the paradox of tolerance. And it's, not something we came up with. It's something that's been out there a long time, but it feels like we're one of the only social media companies that are really talking about it, but it's this idea that a society cannot be tolerant when it is tolerant of intolerance. So the idea is that we allow for free speech in a way, but you can't threaten the existence of another group. You can't, hate speech, I think, is narrowly defined on a lot of platforms, but even like saying that, the idea of saying that trans people don't exist or that it's a mental health problem or things like that, what that does is that causes a trans person who maybe would have otherwise done a post expressing themselves, showing their transition, says, oh no, I'm scared to post now, I'm not going to post. So that's, the Elon Musk version of free speech isn't actually free speech because it's shutting other people down because they're scared to simply exist. So that's how we approach Lips. And what's really been beautiful is that the Lips community is a very diverse group. So we have artists, we have sex workers, we have members of the LGBTQ community, we have allies there, or people that are don't necessarily identify with any of those groups, but are very tired of seeing their friends and loved ones harassed and deplatformed on these other things. So it's, in some ways we're a narrow group in that it's like if you've been marginalized on the internet, but the problem is that it's a growing group, and so it's a lot of different types of people on Lips these days.
Well, that actually is an interesting thing, is what is the connection between artists and sex workers?
Yeah.
If you can talk a little bit about that, because we're all having that same issue. And I'm not a sex worker, but I'm an artist. And how can we work together? There's already, it seems like they're all working together on Lips. So can you talk about that connection?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think allyship between people that are, in these historically marginalized categories, or, making content online that is being pushed to the margins due to religious bias, due to sexism, homophobia, all this stuff. Really, there's a potential for really strong allyship there. And so the connection I see, on day-to-day, just being on Lips, working with this community, is that the lines between sex work and art are very blurred. And it's something that I think if you sort of take a step back and look at our culture through that lens, you can see that almost every aspect of modern culture is somehow influenced by sex worker culture. And a big reason for what that is because sex workers in a lot of ways are innovators in technology, they're innovators in culture, because you have to constantly navigate how culture is changing to be seen, to be heard, and to stay safe. And so, I'll give an example. Like right now, on Lips, you see a lot of overlap between sex workers and artists, because there's a lot of folks who, want to be full-time artists, or they see themselves as full-time artists because, one, they're creating sex work content, which is very, many times very beautiful, these elaborate photo shoots, these colors, these costumes that you put on, and you can see that when you go to Lips. But then also they create 2D art, they create 3D art, they're doing art outside of their bodies as well. But that's a whole nother thing of saying, okay, well, if I'm creating art with my body versus creating art of my body, what's the difference? So there's a lot of interesting theoretical things there as well. But I find that if you dive into the sex worker community, you'll find that so many working galleries, they are creating art, they're having very successful art careers, And a lot of times that because they're able to support themselves. And, you know, if you talk to a lot, I think that's one of the biggest myths that, you know, you can dispel when you go on Lips, is that a lot of times sex workers view their career as freedom, as a way to live the life that they want to live without going to a 9-to-5 job. We also have a lot of chronically ill sex workers on Lips who, you know, that's one of the scariest positions I think to be in, because if you get deplatformed and you have nowhere to be on the internet, you don't even have the option to, you know, start working on, you know, the in-person sex work. Like digital sex work is where you are and what you can do. And so, you know, it's just so important for a lot of reasons, but I'd love to see more acknowledgement of the overlap between sex work and art, and especially when it comes to moderation policies as well, because there is certainly not a hard line when, you know, somebody posts an image promoting their sex work. You know, if you put a frame on it and put up on the wall, it could, you know, very much be an artistic piece. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, here. Yeah. Well, in talking about that, and you bringing up the future of content moderation, what do you see for the future of how content is moderated, and where should it go, in your opinion? And this is a great time for you to really introduce Reliabl to our community.
Yeah. So, you know, content moderation as it is now is, you know, it's so bad. It is surprisingly bad for how many people are on the internet and how many people are on these platforms. Facebook is the #1 site for sex trafficking in the world. And yet not many people talk about that. And, you know, there's not a lot of talk about reforming how they moderate content. If I am, you know, we see examples of this every day, but one example that really stood out to me was one post on Instagram that was talking about LGBTQ education. And it was flagged as sexual solicitation to minors. So you have this very bad labeling system that not only is pushing people off the internet that don't need to be pushed off the internet. In fact, they're there making it a healthier, safer place. Then the problem is that when you label, you know, say 600 posts are labeled as sexual solicitation, say like 550 of those were people just living their lives, existing and trying to share awareness about, you know, body image or LGBTQ issues, or, you know, the importance of understanding sex workers as people. Those get pushed off. And then you have these 50 that are just lost in the shuffle that might be actual, like trafficking, actual, you know, illegal activity. And so, you know, for me, the future of content moderation is 2 parts. One is more accurate. And so that's going to require more care and more need for people to start collecting data on content posted by marginalized users. Right now, there's a study by the Brennan Center that's really interesting, that talks about how dominant groups are less likely to be, you know, flagged as inappropriate on these social media sites. So essentially, if you're white, straight, male, cisgendered, you are less likely to have a post flagged, even if you posted the exact same content. And you see that a lot with, again, male-owned accounts and accounts owned by marginalized groups. Now, you know, in the future, or what's happening because of that, is because the majority of the data sets that these algorithms are programmed to look at are actually coming from like those groups. Those dominant groups are creating the algorithms that then, you know, flag what the content is. So you are going to get a preference of the dominant groups. Now, the future of it is more accurate in that data set, if we could input data that's labeled by people, labeled by these actual groups. So it's actual, like, you know, women that are labeling images of their own bodies. It's you know, Black creators who are labeling anti-racist posts as being anti-racist, not as hate speech. If you bring that data into the mix, then you'll start to see less of that. So what Reliabl does is essentially we have built this software that allows users to participate in the moderation system. So essentially, it's kind of a form of consent, because if I post something on Instagram, I don't know how Instagram is labeling it until I get a flag saying sexual solicitation. But on Lips, it's very transparent. You can see, okay, this is being labeled as erotic art. This is being labeled as nudity. This is being labeled as, you know, cannabis use. Like, you know, you get all those tags there. And that works twofold. One, it gives you transparency. It gives people agency over how their posts are categorized and labeled. And the other thing is it creates this data library that is by and for marginalized groups. So you have, suddenly you have all this data that didn't exist on marginalized groups, which in, you know, a technical sense, when you add those data sets to the existing data sets that are doing, you know, content moderation, you get accurate. So for me, I see the future of content moderation being more accurate, but also participatory, because I have my own biases. You know, as a person, I have intersecting identities, but those are limited. So if you open it up to not just me, the moderator, labeling data, and open it up to the whole community labeling data, it's not going to be perfect. You're not going to never have instances of biases, but you will have a lot less.
And it gives more control. Like it's
Yes.
almost as if you're taking power over your content again.
Yes.
As well. So that I know people would be very excited about that.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing that I think will be of real interest to your audience, is that there's a number of laws right now. There's one in California, one in Europe, that are basically saying that these platforms, specifically user-generated content platforms, primarily targeting social media platforms, have to be more transparent about how they moderate content. And I don't, like, you know, what we're hoping at Reliabl is that, you know, since we built this software, we could, you know, very easily get, you know, plugged in to pretty instantly have some transparency around moderation for users pretty quickly. And so just something to keep an eye on are those laws that are coming up around transparency and accountability in content moderation for platforms.
I know
And so
that
sorry.
I'm sorry. I know that you're planning on having all that data. Are you going to go to any of those user generated content like Instagram and say, hey, we have the data here. Can we be a consultant to you and how to implement that? Is that something that you're planning at all, or have you thought?
Yeah, we would love that. I mean, essentially, you know, the idea is that we would right now we're working with niche social media networks or user-generated content platforms that have a significant number of marginalized users on the platform. And so that way we can collect, you know, their input on on how to label certain pieces of content. And then the goal is that we create this anonymized data library that has that data in it, also eventually like our own algorithm. But yeah, we could go to someone like Instagram and we could say, hey, do you want to plug this data set? You essentially, you enter into a data sharing agreement where, you know, they get access to this data library and then that informs and supplements what they're already using. And that could help improve their AI moderation to not be so biased. So that is an eventual goal of ours. You know, the question has been brought up, you know, does Instagram even care, right? Like, Would they even want, more marginalized data, or do they not even care? My argument is essentially, with this regulation coming up, with things in the state of California, within Europe, and it'll probably spread to other states as well, that accountability will be required. And then once that's required, then they'll be more open to, working with companies like Reliabl.
Yeah, exactly. It might ultimately incentivize them to do that.
Yeah.
If they don't do that, what do you think will happen?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we've seen that some of these social media platforms are so influential in, the legal system, that it's a little bit scary to think on a federal level, like how much power that they have. But I think even if they're able to sort of skirt past some of the moderation regulation, I think that what's going to happen is the shift is going to become very noticeable in who's on their platform, because you can already see it today. The Lips account on Instagram, I follow, primarily sex workers, artists, maybe mutual aid pages run by Black and Indigenous activists. That's the content we follow. When I go to my Explore page on Instagram, it is nothing but makeup and Taylor Swift. And I don't know how that happened. And so I think what's going to happen is people are going to start to notice, why aren't I seeing any diverse faces? And so it's going to be a combination of the people that have been kicked off or deplatformed or shadow banned, really continuing to make, their case for why this is unfair and in the media. And, I think these groups have done a really good job of bringing it to the surface of how corrupt these moderation systems are. So you see it in the news, but I think you'll continue to see it in the news in a way where it might affect, the stock market price of some of these companies, and bad PR. And then you also get the users who are saying, I can't find any of my favorite creators anymore because they've all either left or been pushed off. So I think it's going to be a regulation decision, but it's also going to be a PR and user decision, that if these companies don't go into that direction, they're going to be left behind by platforms that do adopt a more transparent and more equitable moderation system.
It's interesting because I noticed recently, and maybe it's because there's been some mass layoffs, but I'm noticing a lot more nudity in my Explore page. I'm noticing a lot more artwork of nudes.
Interesting.
And more more avant-garde stuff. And I just thought, well, that's interesting, because like you said, it was makeup, and it was, more celebrity based stuff. And, I see a lot of posts by Madonna, or, or one of her by fans or something, and now all of a sudden it's just a lot more different. Do you think it's because there's been some mass layoffs, and so there's not a lot of the content moderation system is just kind of getting, I don't know, worse and worse and worse in their eyes? I mean, or maybe for us it's better.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing more of that artwork now.
That's a really good question. I think so. In the case of Twitter, right? In the case of Twitter, I think you're going to see, because they've basically gotten rid of their moderation team, you're going to probably see more nudity on Twitter, but then you're also going to get more instances of hate speech as well. So you won't have that balance at all. It'll just sort of be the Wild West. In the case of Instagram, I think what it is that they are experimenting with ways of, okay, how can we let some, nudity with art through the cracks? And what'd be really interesting is when you go to that Explore page and you go to click on that nudity, see who's creating that art, because
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, it'll probably be a male artist, honestly.
Yeah.
Because if I go on Instagram right now, I could go to the Playboy, page, and it's pretty much full on nudity. I mean, there's maybe one pixelated spot, but it is full on nudity. And I think it's like, what is the gaze too, right? So is it a male gaze versus a female gaze versus a non-binary gaze versus a feminist gaze? Because a lot of the times, if I'm creating art that like challenges the status quo of what beauty is, if I post a naked picture of myself with hairy legs and hairy armpits, it's actually much more likely to be taken down much faster if I had posted the exact same picture, with everything shaved. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we are seeing, if you see Instagram start, changing its moderation policies or things like that to allow for more nudity, it's like, okay, that's fine, but still, where is this perspective coming from? Like it's still very much a top-down decision where they're deciding still what's okay for us to see, what's not okay for us to see. And that's where I think we have to be careful, because if we say, oh, great, they're allowing nudity now, that's perfect. But it's like, who's creating the art? Like, what is the lens that we're looking at that nudity from? And that's where I think also an alliance with sex workers, an alliance with activists who are being pushed off of these platforms really serves artists well, because you get a broader idea of what a truly equitable moderation policy would look like, as opposed to one that just serves one type of artist.
Yeah.
Well, now that we're approaching the end of our interview, is there anything in particular you want the Don't Delete Art community to know? Anything you want to leave us with?
I think, what keeps me so passionate about this cause is that I know that sharing your artwork, whether you are a amateur artist or a, fine art artist that's, making millions of dollars a year, sharing your art to the internet or to an audience is part of the artistic process, right? So if I'm making art as a healing experience or something that makes me feel good, and it just stays in my sketchbook, studies have shown that actually isn't the full process, of why art is so healing. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, especially when trying to encourage artists to think outside of just their experience and think of this as a collective cause that's worth fighting for not just you and people like you, but people who are, dealing with the same issue with different experiences. Is that ability to exist online is incredibly important for one's mental health in the modern age. So, even me, who I, study this, I know that there are all these bias structures in place. When I get a post removed that says, either for sexual solicitation or, inappropriate, you will be banned if you keep doing this, there's still a part of me that kind of hurts when that happens. Sure. And I think, especially for, folks who are trans, who, really have a hard time in day-to-day life. And this isn't all trans people, but a lot of trans people, especially young trans people and young LGBTQ people, who have trouble being themselves in their day-to-day life, and they can go to the internet and they can be themselves and they can find a community. Same with sex workers, people who are very vulnerable in our society because we don't have the structures to protect them. I think those people need the internet more than anybody, and they need to be able to exist on the internet. And so when you're thinking about this issue, you as the Don't Delete Art viewer, think about it as like a mental health issue, think about it as a human rights issue. And that's I think for me, what helps keep me inspired to keep doing this, and just seeing that, you know, if you provide a space or if you really speak out against this stuff, people are very grateful, because there aren't a lot of people advocating for these folks to exist online. And especially as an artist, you want, you know, the world to be as diverse and weird and wonderful as possible. So if you don't want a very vanilla, very sad internet, then it's definitely a cause worth fighting for.
Well, I am certainly one of these people who's super grateful to have you out there
Yes.
establishing a better system for us, proving that it's possible. You know, I think that's
It's
something that we're
really
up against
been
all the time. We just are just drowning in this macho Silicon Valley bro
Yeah.
mindset, you know, and we forget that it could be different. And so,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah,
you're a hero.
great point, because you
Yeah.
know, we could spend all our time talking about, you know, what's wrong with the internet and all these things, but there are a lot of great things about it. And like, it is possible to take what's really great about it and bring it to a place where, you know, it doesn't silence, you know, swaths of people. So I would say that's really important to keep in mind too, is that this is all very possible. Moderation does not have to be this way, even though they tell us that this is the way it has to be. It certainly does not. And so it's just about bringing awareness to projects, you know, like Reliabl, but there are other projects out there too that are, you know, trying to imagine what the internet could look like without, you know, these sort of oppressive bias structures.
I think that's for me why I get juiced up talking to you, because you're someone who's really making it happen and saying, no, there's this way we can do it. Join this revolution, because we're actually fixing it or trying to make it better, and not just giving up and going, oh, well. There
Right.
are people out there, when people say, well, just create your own social media network, there are others out there that we can join that are doing it better than maybe we could. I mean,
Yeah, well, it's a
you're
collective effort.
steps ahead, and it's really exciting to see someone who's in the forefront, especially in that tech bro world.
Yes, well, it's certainly not easy, but it is a collective effort, and there's a lot of people out there that are supporting what we're doing, you know, like y'all. And you know, I think it's just a matter of working together and finding more ways to collaborate. So I can't wait to collaborate more with Don't Delete Art and all the cool
Yeah.
things you guys are doing as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're
Yes.
really excited about our collab, and that's
Yeah.
coming soon. Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. You're going to see more of Annie Brown and
Yes.
hear more about Reliabl. And Don't Delete Art is a big fan of what you're doing.
Yes.
Well,
So,
ditto.
thank you so much for taking time today. And for all our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for sticking with us. And we'll have more to you very soon. So Don't Delete Art, Lips Inc., Lips.Social. Is that how you want people to find you?
Yeah, it's Lips.Social. And then we're
Lips.Social.
at Lips_zine on Instagram.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Emma.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay. Have a great day or night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.